The sparkling chandelier above bathed the room in warm, golden light, casting a luxurious glow over one of the most sophisticated restaurants in Bel Air. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, the sound of crystal glasses clinking together, and each guest was a symbol of wealth and status. But when the door swung open, a towering figure entered, Shaquille O'Neal. Not in a sharp suit or shiny shoes, but simply in a gray t-shirt and worn-out sneakers. The judgment was instant. No words were needed, but it was unmistakably clear. A young server approached, her appearance professional, yet her voice betrayed a note of disdain. "Are you sure you can afford a meal here?" she asked, loud enough for others to hear. A ripple of whispers spread across the room, eyes exchanging glances, and a stage was set for an unexpected moment. What happened next was a lesson that left the entire room in shock. A clear reminder of how first impressions can deceive us. If you're curious about what happened next, keep watching. This story will surely change your perspective. The story begins. Bel Air, where every corner sparkles with the light of luxury, is home to the Luminary, a renowned restaurant known as a symbol of sophistication and elegance. Tonight, sleek sports cars are parked outside, guests stepping out in flowing silk gowns and impeccably tailored suits. The chandelier lights inside reflect through the glass doors, creating a dreamlike spectacle. It is the stage for wealth and refinement, a space where every detail exudes grandeur. The glass doors of the Luminary gently open, and a towering figure enters, immediately drawing every gaze. Shaquille O'Neal, over 7 feet tall, strides confidently into the restaurant. Unlike the usual clientele at the Luminary, Shaq wears a simple gray t-shirt, comfortable sweatpants, and worn-out sneakers. In a place where luxury brands define personal status, his simplicity becomes a stark contrast. Conversations at nearby tables briefly pause as eyes turn toward him. Some recognize the basketball legend immediately, whispers of curiosity spreading. Others, unfamiliar with his fame, only see the clear disparity between him and the meticulously groomed patrons who frequent the Luminary. Shaq's quiet confidence seems to resonate louder than the sound of clinking crystal glasses. His presence, it seems, challenges the very essence of what this restaurant represents. At the front desk, Alyssa, a young waitress with an air of self-satisfaction, stands in her pristine uniform, her neatly styled hair reflecting the polished image the Luminary demands of its staff. Her smile is professional and polite, yet her eyes radiate arrogance. Having worked at the Luminary for several years, Alyssa prides herself on her role at the most prestigious restaurant in Bel Air. However, that pride sometimes leads her to judge others based solely on their outward appearance. As Alyssa's gaze settles on Shaq, she can't hide her displeasure. She quickly takes in his athletic wear. A brief flicker of disdain passes over her face, her eyebrow arching with condescension. She thinks to herself, someone like him doesn't belong here. Despite being a server, Alyssa often sees herself as the guardian of the Luminary's sophistication. In her mind, customers must radiate an aura of suitability in every detail, from their attire to their demeanor. The man before her raised doubts. Did he have the financial means to dine here, let alone blend into this refined space? Shaquille O'Neal, seemingly oblivious to Alyssa's gaze and attitude, walks toward the front desk. He smiles, his voice warm and composed. "Good evening. I'd like to make a reservation if there's availability." Alyssa hesitates for a moment at the pleasant tone of his voice but quickly regains her air of superiority. "Good evening," she responds, her professional smile barely concealing the contempt in her tone. "But this is a high-end restaurant. Are you sure you want to dine here?" Her words carried more than the meaning of a polite inquiry. They were a challenge. A few curious glances from nearby patrons turned toward the exchange. Shaq looks directly into her eyes, his smile unwavering. "Yes, I'd like to try dining here," he replies calmly, his deep voice friendly and unbothered. Alyssa glares at him openly but maintains her professional facade. "All right, I'll check for availability. Please wait a moment." She turns away, but in her mind, she thinks, he won't last long here. Let's see how he reacts when he sees the prices on the menu. Shaquille O'Neal, a man who has faced immense pressure on the basketball court, now quietly observes the opulent surroundings of the luminary. The golden light from the crystal chandeliers reflects on his face, showcasing his calm and confidence. He doesn't say another word, but his nonchalant attitude only heightens the curiosity of those around him. Tonight, Shaq has entered a world of luxury, but he doesn't belong here, or rather, Shaquille O'Neal is preparing to challenge the rigid prejudices built within this very world. Alyssa returns to the front desk, a self-satisfied expression she can hardly mask. She has worked at the luminary long enough to believe herself to be the ultimate judge of the level of sophistication the restaurant embodies. In her eyes, Shaq, with his casual outfit and composed demeanor, is completely out of place. "Are you sure you want to dine here?" she asks, her voice dripping with sarcasm, her eyes lingering on his worn sneakers before moving to his face. Her smile tightens into one of disdain, her tone loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Shaq, who had long grown accustomed to judgmental stares and condescending remarks, simply smiled softly. He faced Alyssa with unwavering eyes. "Yes, I'd like to experience it here," he responded, his voice calm and polite. His composure rendered Alyssa's mocking attitude nearly meaningless, but she persisted. Tilting her head, her half-smirk regal, she seemed determined to make him feel uncomfortable. She turned with exaggerated grace, her movements almost theatrical, and called over her shoulder, "I believe I'll find a seat that suits you." Her tone carried an undertone of feigned politeness. With calculated steps, Alyssa led Shaq through the heart of the restaurant, where tables were impeccably set under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The patrons exuded elegance and confidence, chatting merrily. However, Alyssa didn't stop at any of these tables. She continued walking, guiding Shaq to the farthest corner of the restaurant, where the lighting dimmed and the atmosphere seemed less refined. Finally, she halted at a table near the kitchen, where the clattering of dishes and the faint scent of food lingered in the air. Alyssa turned back to him, a fake smile on her face. "This should be perfect for your style," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear. She dropped the menu onto the table with a thud, as if to emphasize her words. Shaq glanced at the table, then back at Alyssa. His expression remained composed, his smile unchanging. "Thank you," he said simply as he pulled out the chair and sat down comfortably, as though she had just led him to the best seat in the house. His calm gaze suggested that nothing happening around him could disrupt his inner peace. Alyssa faltered for a moment, her eyes narrowing in disappointment. She had hoped to see him flustered, embarrassed, or better yet, leave. However, Shaq's calm demeanor only served to irritate her further. She turned away, but not without loudly adding, "I hope you enjoy your seat. Not everyone gets such a special one." The surrounding diners began to murmur, some casting sympathetic glances at Shaq, while others curiously observed. A young woman, Emily, shook her head and whispered to her companion, "She's so rude. He didn't do anything wrong." Meanwhile, at one of the central tables, basking in the soft light of the restaurant, the Andersons, an elderly couple, were watching the scene unfold. Mr. Anderson, a dignified man with silver hair, took a sip of wine and whispered to his wife, "He's so composed." Most people would have reacted by now. Back at the hostess stand, Alyssa smirked, satisfied with what she believed was the resolution of the matter. In her mind, there was no way Shaq would stay here for long. However, as she relished in what seemed like a certain victory, an invisible unease began to spread throughout the restaurant. Shaq, though saying little, had made a lasting impression, not just because of his imposing stature, but also because of his poise and dignity. Tonight, the luminary would become more than just an upscale restaurant. It would serve as the stage for an unforgettable lesson. Alyssa stood just a few steps away from Shaq's table, her gaze flicking over him as though calculating her next move to reinforce the power she thought she held. The previous actions, from selecting a special seat to her subtle remarks, seemed insufficient to satisfy her sense of superiority. She turned back, holding a soft leather menu, approaching Shaq's table with the sharp sound of her heels striking the wooden floor, an unmistakable announcement of her presence. She held the menu in one hand, a smirk on her lips. The irritation caused by Shaq's composure simmered beneath her polished exterior. Dropping the menu onto the table with a flourish, she leaned toward him, her voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Would you like me to explain the menu?" she asked, her tone purposefully arrogant. "We have a selection of exquisite dishes here, quite different from what you may be used to." Her eyes flicked over his simple t-shirt and sneakers, disdain evident. Shaq looked up at her, his expression unchanged. "No, thank you," he replied courteously, calmly flipping open the menu. Alyssa lingered, watching him scan the options, certain that he would be flustered upon seeing the prices. When his gaze lingered on a particular dish, she seized the opportunity to mock him. She pointed to the corner of the menu, where the restaurant's most expensive item was listed. "The most expensive dish here is $380, she emphasized each word, her eyes fixed on Shaq's face, searching for any sign of discomfort or hesitation. Shaq sat solid as a rock, unaffected by the gentle waves of conversation and glances that surrounded him. His eyes flickered up for a moment, catching a trace of amusement. "I'll have the fette mignon rossini," he said, his voice calm and composed, as though ordering the simplest dish on the menu. Alyssa hesitated, momentarily taken aback by his nonchalant choice of the priciest item on the menu. Her composure quickly regained, she let out a derisive laugh, loud enough to catch the attention of nearby diners. "Really?" she asked sweetly, but her tone dripped with sarcasm. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't something everyone's familiar with." Nearby patrons began to murmur. A couple sitting at a nearby table whispered, "She's rude, how can she talk to a guest like that?" The man shook his head. "She probably thinks he can't afford it." Alyssa, seemingly oblivious to the negative reactions around her, remained by Shaq's table, her hand resting on the edge of the table, awaiting his response. But Shaq only smiled, his gaze as steady as ever. "Thank you for the suggestion, I'm looking forward to trying it," he said, his tone warm, composed, and entirely unfazed. Alyssa's unease simmered beneath the surface. In her mind, the tall man before her, dressed in a simple tracksuit and worn shoes, could never truly appreciate the value of such a luxurious dish. But what she failed to realize was that her attitude and actions revealed her own shallowness and lack of professionalism. Frustration bubbled within Alyssa as she straightened up and turned to walk away, muttering loudly enough for others to hear, "Let's see how long he can stand looking at the bill." As she turned, she raised her voice intentionally, ensuring the nearby diners could hear. "Fette mignon rossini, he probably doesn't even know what he's ordering. People like him just pick the most expensive thing to look fancy, but wait, when it's time to pay, I'm sure he'll walk right out." Despite sitting down, Shaq could feel the weight of the gazes around him. Some diners looked at him with sympathy, while others watched with curiosity. Yet, Shaq showed no sign of discomfort or self-consciousness. Instead, he calmly opened the menu, casually browsing through the other dishes as if he were embarking on a culinary adventure. From the counter, Alyssa watched him intently, a flash of anger crossing her face as she realized he was not rattled. But a twisted sense of satisfaction crept in, convinced she had proven her superiority over someone she deemed unfit for the world of the luminary. At a distant table, Mr. Anderson, an older gentleman, watched the scene with quiet observation. He turned to his wife and whispered, "He's testing everyone's patience." "Quite interesting." The atmosphere in the restaurant grew hushed, though an undeniable tension lingered, like a spark waiting to ignite. Shaq remained unruffled, as if savoring the moment, preparing for something far beyond Alyssa's expectations or the restaurant's comprehension. Alyssa turned away, her mocking smile still lingering on her lips. She walked toward the counter, leaning toward her colleague Ryan, who was reviewing the reservation list. "He'll leave the moment he sees the bill. People like him only pretend to be classy. Look at him, he ordered the most expensive dish and doesn't even seem to know what he's doing. I'm sure he won't make it to dessert." Ryan, a mild-mannered young man, glanced briefly at Shaq, still sitting quietly in the corner like an immovable mountain amid the curious gazes. "Maybe he's just here to enjoy the experience," Ryan replied softly, just loud enough for Alyssa to hear. "Who knows, maybe he has his reasons." Alyssa scoffed, shaking her head. Reasons? Look at his clothes. Who comes to a place like this wearing old shoes if not to pretend? People like him think they can fool everyone. Ryan avoided her gaze, not wanting to argue. Though uncomfortable with her attitude, Ryan knew any opposition would only fuel her arrogance. Across the room, Shaq sat undisturbed, completely unaffected by the whispers behind him. He leisurely flipped through the menu, as though relishing each moment in the luxurious surroundings. Occasionally, curious glances from nearby tables were directed at him, but Shaq responded with a gentle smile, unfazed and composed. At a nearby table, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, an elderly couple, silently observed the unfolding scene. Mr. Anderson, a refined man with silver hair, slowly lifted his glass of wine, his gaze glinting with understanding as if he had seen countless similar stories unfold. He subtly nodded toward Shaq, a small but meaningful gesture. Shaq met his eyes and smiled in return, his expression conveying the message, "I'm fine, thank you." Mrs. Anderson gently leaned toward her husband and whispered, "It's strange, why are they treating him like that? What does she think he is?" Mr. Anderson placed his glass down, his gaze still fixed on Shaq. "There's something special about him, his calmness, it's not something everyone possesses." On the other side of the room, Alyssa continued commenting with Ryan, but this time she let her voice carry enough for nearby diners to hear, "See? He didn't even bother to make a reservation. People like him just want to sneak in unnoticed. But I bet once he sees the bill, he'll bolt." A few patrons at the nearby tables glanced toward Alyssa, their faces reflecting growing displeasure. In another corner, Emily, a young businesswoman dining with a friend, furrowed her brow. She turned to her companion and said, "She's so rude. He hasn't done anything to deserve that treatment." Her friend, a composed young man, nodded in agreement. It seems like his presence is what's upsetting her. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift, but not in the tranquil way the luminary was known for. Alyssa's words, the silent stares of the other diners, and Shaq's unwavering calm created a subtle tension. Meanwhile, Shaq continued to savor the moment. He didn't allow the gossip to affect his mood. Though he knew he was being judged, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. At the Andersons' table, Mr. Anderson sighed lightly, his gaze still on Shaq. "The world is strange," he said in a warm, yet slightly disappointed tone. "People forget that a person's true worth isn't in their appearance." Mrs. Anderson nodded in agreement, but they both understood that tonight wouldn't end the way Alyssa imagined. She might think she was controlling the situation, but clearly, in this room, Shaq's presence had dominated the air. After hearing the whispers, Alyssa decided to elevate her sense of superiority to a whole new level. In her mind, Shaq didn't deserve the polite service the luminary was famous for, at least not from her. She turned away and grabbed her notepad, proceeding to serve other tables as though Shaq didn't exist. She paused at the central table, where a wealthy couple was enjoying red wine, flashing a bright smile and using the sweetest tone. "Would you like to add a bottle of Margaux 2015? It pairs perfectly with the main course." The couple nodded, and Alyssa quickly took their order, interspersing a few jokes to prolong the conversation. However, her eyes kept darting back to Shaq's table, where he still sat calmly, seemingly unfazed by her deliberate indifference. Alyssa passed Shaq's table several times, pretending to be busy with a tray in hand, her eyes fixed on another table. She acted as though she hadn't noticed him. The click of her heels echoed steadily on the wooden floor, a rhythm of indifference. Shaq, a man who had faced some of the toughest opponents on the basketball court, remained completely composed. His hands rested gently on the table, his eyes occasionally roaming the room, a quiet curiosity in them. A small jazz band played in the far corner of the restaurant, their light melodies floating through the space, creating a pleasant atmosphere. When the music ended, Shaq clapped his hands, the warm sound reverberating, causing the band members to smile. Shaq's applause not only drew the attention of the band but also sparked curiosity among the surrounding diners. Some began to wonder, how could he maintain such calm, even when it was clear he was being treated unjustly? Alyssa frowned, the polite smile she typically reserved for other customers now gone. Shaq's composure frustrated her more than she had anticipated. She felt like he was challenging her. Why isn't he saying anything? No complaints, no requests for service, she thought, biting her lip in frustration. Determined to test Shaq's patience further, Alyssa decided to delay things even more. She walked over to another table where a group of diners had just sat down and began explaining the menu in detail, fully aware that this would extend Shaq's waiting time. At another table, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, who had been silently observing the situation, grew more concerned. Mrs. Anderson leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you see what she's doing? She's clearly making it difficult for him. He's been waiting for at least 15 minutes." Mr. Anderson took a sip of his wine, his sharp gaze never leaving Alyssa. "I see, but what's interesting is that he doesn't seem bothered at all. He's waiting, but not for the food. I think he's waiting for something else." Shaq sat there, occasionally glancing at the paintings on the walls or the sparkling chandelier overhead. His unshakable composure not only heightened Alyssa's frustration but also exposed the pettiness in her actions. As Alyssa passed Shaq's table once more, she deliberately turned her back and spoke loudly enough for her colleagues to hear. "Sometimes, I think some people don't understand that not everyone deserves to be here. It's amusing to see how hard they try to fit in." Although her words weren't directed explicitly at Shaq, the target was unmistakable. A few diners began murmuring among themselves. Some clearly disapproved but refrained from intervening. At another table, Emily, a young businesswoman dining with a friend, couldn't stay silent any longer. She set her wineglass down and turned to her companion. "She's awful. I can't believe this restaurant keeps someone like her." Her friend nodded thoughtfully before replying, "But look at him. He doesn't need anyone to defend him. He knows exactly what he's doing." The prolonged wait turned into a tense performance, with Shaq's calm confidence making him the undeniable focal point. Yet, it was that very composure that laid bare Alyssa's unprofessionalism and pettiness, an awareness she had yet to confront. The atmosphere in the luminary grew increasingly charged, not from noise, but from the unusual silence surrounding Shaq. He remained at his corner table near the kitchen, serene, while Alyssa blatantly ignored him. Her unprofessional and rude behavior was no longer a secret, it had caught the attention of many diners. At the central table, Mr. Anderson leaned forward, his voice low but laced with indignation. "She's downright disrespectful," he said, his eyes fixed on Alyssa, who was laughing with another group of diners. Mrs. Anderson, who had been quietly observing, nodded, her expression one of discomfort. "I've never seen an employee behave like that. She's clearly trying to humiliate him. We should report her to the manager." Mr. Anderson set his glass down, his face calm but resolute. "I agree. Someone like her doesn't belong here. But let's see how this unfolds first." In another corner of the restaurant, Emily, a young businesswoman with neatly cropped hair, could no longer hold back her disapproval. She shook her head, her eyes filled with frustration as she watched Alyssa. Emily had noticed the unfair treatment from the moment Shaq walked in, and Alyssa's actions only fueled her indignation. "She's terrible," Emily said to her friend, who was observing the situation intently. "I can't believe a high-end restaurant like this tolerates such behavior." Her friend furrowed their brow in thought before responding, "Maybe because he hasn't said anything, they think he's easy to overlook. But I get the feeling he's waiting for the right moment." Emily tilted her head, her gaze curious as she looked toward Shaq, who remained composed and upright. "He's so confident, but I hope the manager steps in soon. Letting this go on is unfair," she murmured. Nearby, Mrs. Harrison, an older woman seated quietly with her granddaughter, watched everything unfold. She took a sip of tea, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "This is disgraceful," she said, her voice calm yet weighty. "Staff are here to serve, not to judge their guests. That young woman needs to learn a lesson." Her granddaughter, a bright-eyed young woman, leaned in. "Do you think he'll do anything? He's just sitting there, not saying a word." "Silence is an answer in itself," Mrs. Harrison replied, her tone steady. "People who truly know their worth don't need to prove it to anyone. He knows who he is, and that girl will ruin herself." Meanwhile, Alyssa, entirely oblivious to the growing dissatisfaction spreading through the room, continued focusing on her personal agenda. She spent extra time at the central tables, deliberately engaging in lengthy conversations to divert attention from what she perceived as a potential highlight for Shaq. As she passed Shaq's table again, she didn't spare him a glance but spoke loudly enough for a colleague to hear. "This is why we need higher standards. Not everyone understands the sophistication required here, and clearly, not everyone belongs in a place like this." Shaq's calm gaze briefly flicked to Alyssa before he returned to his thoughts, offering no response. He didn't need to react. There was no need to address someone so eager to dig their own grave. Instead, he simply smiled faintly and continued observing the room, where other diners had begun whispering among themselves. At the central table, Mr. Anderson turned to Mrs. Anderson, his voice firm but measured. "We need to speak to the manager immediately. This isn't just an act of injustice, it's poisoning the entire atmosphere of the restaurant." Mrs. Anderson nodded, her expression full of empathy as she glanced at Shaq. "I hope he doesn't leave before this gets resolved. He deserves respect." And so, the quiet sophistication that typically defined the luminary was replaced by a tense and volatile energy, like a taut string ready to snap. Alyssa, smug in her actions, remained oblivious to the fact that the very patrons she assumed would ignore the injustice were now firmly siding with Shaq. Silence was no longer their response. The tension in the luminary thickened, the air charged with discomfort. It was palpable, an invisible thread stretched to its breaking point. Finally, after several deliberate passes by Shaq's table without stopping, Alyssa approached. She carried a silver tray with the restaurant's signature dish, filet mignon rossini, a $380 masterpiece. Her deliberate steps echoed sharply on the polished wooden floor, drawing the attention of every diner in the room. Her eyes gleamed with arrogance, her gait exuding an air of reluctant superiority. When she reached Shaq's table, Alyssa paused, placing the plate on the table with more force than necessary. The clatter of the dish against the surface reverberated in the air. Her smile was cold, her demeanor daring. "Here's your order. I hope you'll know how to appreciate it," she said, her tone sharp with mockery. Shaq, as always, maintained his poise, his expression courteous and composed. He glanced at the exquisitely plated dish before looking back at her. "It looks wonderful." "Thank you," he replied warmly, his tone genuine, as though he hadn't registered the hostility in her words. Refusing to let the matter end there, Alyssa leaned in slightly, her posture seemingly friendly but laced with a subtle menace. Her voice lowered, just enough for Shaq to hear, yet dripping with condescension. "This dish is for connoisseurs. I suppose this is your first time trying it." Shaq's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. There was no anger, no irritation in his eyes. Instead, he offered a small smile and nodded. "Thank you for the insight," he replied. His calm demeanor unsettled Alyssa, but it was her own pettiness that began to shine through, noticed by everyone around. Emily, seated at a nearby table, couldn't contain herself any longer. She leaned toward her companion, her voice simmering with outrage. He just politely thanked her, and she's still mocking him. Unbelievable. Her friend nodded, their gaze fixed on Shaq's table. "She's trying to provoke him, but I think she picked the wrong target." At the center of the room, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson continued observing, their expressions stern. Mr. Anderson lifted his wine glass but didn't drink, his eyes never leaving Alyssa. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he remarked in a low, firm tone. "A man like him doesn't need to say or do anything. She'll end up embarrassing herself." Unaware of the growing judgment from those around her, Alyssa straightened. She scrutinized Shaq once more, searching for any sign of discomfort or anger but found none. A faint sense of defeat crept in, and in an attempt to mask it, she added a parting jab. "If this dish isn't to your taste, we have simpler options available. Feel free to order something else." Shaq's serene smile remained. He gave a polite nod. "Thank you, I'll keep that in mind," he said, his tone steady and courteous. His unshakable composure only deepened Alyssa's frustration. Clutching her notepad tightly, she spun on her heel and walked away, refusing to look back. Reaching the service station, she slammed the silver tray onto the counter, startling Ryan, her coworker. "He's just pretending to be polite," she hissed through clenched teeth. "I bet he doesn't even know what he ordered. People like him only come here to show off." Ryan frowned, his disapproval evident. "Maybe he just wanted a quiet meal." "Isn't our job to serve everyone?" he asked. Alyssa turned to him, her expression disdainful. "Can't you see, Ryan? He doesn't belong here, and I'm sure he'll leave the moment he sees the check." Meanwhile, Shaq began to savor the filet mignon rossini before him. The tender beef, paired with foie gras and truffle sauce, was a masterpiece of flavor and presentation. He ate slowly, deliberately, his expression composed. Around him, murmurs from other diners grew louder. Some voiced their anger on his behalf, while others cast disapproving glances at Alyssa. Though no one spoke up directly, the atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted, from refined elegance to an uneasy tension that hung in the air. Shaq, seated in the most secluded corner, had inadvertently become the center of attention. Yet, he did nothing but enjoy his meal with a calm grace, as if he were the one orchestrating the entire scene. Alyssa remained oblivious to the fact that her actions were leading her toward a lesson she would never forget. As she turned away from Shaq's table, a smug smile lingered on her lips. She believed she was in control, confident that her delays and sharp remarks would eventually drive Shaq out of the restaurant in humiliation. What she didn't anticipate was how drastically the atmosphere at the Luminary would shift in the seconds that followed. The tension in the restaurant grew heavier as the situation unfolded silently. The sharp click of Alyssa's heels echoed steadily as she moved between tables, her smirk intact as she whispered to a colleague, "He's probably just here to show off. Let's see how he reacts when he gets the bill." From the reception desk, the restaurant's manager, Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, stepped out. His stride toward Shaq's table was brisk, his face marked with visible concern. His appearance immediately drew the attention of nearby diners, who began glancing toward the restaurant's shadowed corner. As Mr. Johnson reached the table, he inclined his head slightly, his voice low and filled with respect. "Shaq, it's an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay. We weren't aware you'd be joining us tonight." His words were like a lightning strike, shattering the delicate balance of the room. The murmurs around the restaurant abruptly ceased, giving way to a stunned silence. Nearby diners, already curious, now stared wide-eyed in disbelief at what they just heard. Shaq, ever composed, set down his knife and fork and looked up at Mr. Johnson. He smiled warmly. In his signature gentle yet commanding tone, he replied, "It's all right. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner." Across the room, Alyssa froze, tray still in hand, her wide eyes fixated on the exchange between Mr. Johnson and Shaq. The words echoed in her mind, shattering her earlier confidence. Did he just call him Shaq? The question spiraled through her thoughts as she struggled to accept the truth. Glancing around, Alyssa noticed that every gaze in the restaurant was now focused on Shaq, and more damningly on her. A young couple seated nearby whispered, their voices carrying just enough for Alyssa to hear. "That's Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend. He owns stakes in several companies." Another diner added, "And he's a renowned philanthropist. How could the staff here not recognize him?" The murmurs spread like ripples through the restaurant. Faces that had once been merely curious now filled with admiration and astonishment. A few diners turned to look at Alyssa, their expressions silently judging her. Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of panic and humiliation washing over her. She stood rooted in place, unable to move forward or retreat. Her face paled, her trembling hands gripping the tray as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Mr. Johnson turned briefly, casting a sharp glance in Alyssa's direction. His expression carried an unspoken reprimand, leaving her paralyzed under the weight of his disappointment. Yet, Shaq remained seated, lifting his glass of water and meeting Alyssa's gaze. His eyes, devoid of anger, held only calm authority, a power that made her wish she could disappear. Alyssa realized her behavior had been laid bare for all to see. The room's atmosphere grew heavier with tension. At the central table, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and satisfaction. Mr. Anderson set his wine glass down and whispered, "I knew it. He doesn't need to say a word. His presence speaks volumes." From a nearby table, Emily shook her head, her expression filled with disappointment as she watched Alyssa. "She's ruined herself. An employee who disrespects customers has no place here." Shaq set his glass down and spoke to Mr. Johnson in a gentle yet firm tone. "There's no need to worry. Everything is fine. But I'd like to have a word with your team after my meal." Mr. Johnson immediately nodded, his expression shifting from concern to resolve. "Of course, Shaq. I'll make the arrangements." Shaq's words, though soft, carried undeniable weight. Every eye in the room turned to Alyssa, a silent condemnation reflected in their gazes. What she had intended as a lesson for an arrogant customer had now become a profound lesson for her own career. She realized that tonight, she had lost not just her confidence but possibly her position at this prestigious restaurant. Alyssa stood frozen, feeling as though the ground beneath her had collapsed. The murmurs around her, the scrutinizing gazes of the diners, and the deafening silence from Shaq left her paralyzed. A storm of chaos and fear churned within her, but she couldn't escape the situation she had created. Shaq set his glass of water down on the table, his gaze fixed on Alyssa. His eyes didn't burn with anger, but the sternness in them made her feel as if she were utterly exposed. He leaned forward slightly, his deep voice resonating with calm authority. "Miss Alyssa, what do you think about how you treat customers?" Alyssa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She stammered, her thoughts crumbling into incoherent fragments. I didn't know who you were." Shaq shook his head slightly, his brow furrowing. His voice cut through the tense air like a blade, deliberate and unyielding. "You don't need to know who I am to show respect. Everyone who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity." His words echoed through the room, striking a chord not just with Alyssa but with everyone present. Some diners nodded in agreement, while others exchanged hushed whispers. It was evident that Shaq's message was not solely for Alyssa but for all who could hear him. Alyssa felt her legs grow weak. She struggled to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. Finally, she murmured, her tone barely audible, "But you're not like other customers." Shaq leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering yet tempered with a hint of compassion. He spoke slowly, allowing each word to settle. "Precisely because I'm not like other customers, you need to learn to treat everyone equally. Respect isn't something you reserve for those who are well-dressed, articulate, or outwardly impressive. It's a basic right that everyone deserves." Alyssa lowered her head, clutching her tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't respond, couldn't justify herself. Every action, every word she had spoken that evening replayed in her mind, haunting her like a ghost she couldn't escape. At the central table, Mr. Anderson gave a small nod and whispered to his wife. "He doesn't need to raise his voice or assert his power. What he said and the way he said it are lesson enough for that young woman." Emily, seated nearby, lifted her wine glass but didn't drink. Her gaze remained fixed on Alyssa, disappointment etched across her face. "Maybe she'll remember this lesson for the rest of her life. I just hope she truly changes." Mr. Johnson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward. His voice was firm but carried an undercurrent of kindness. "Alyssa, I think we need to have a conversation after your shift, but for now, let me handle this situation." Alyssa didn't respond, only nodded faintly, avoiding every gaze. She stepped back, her face flushed with a mix of shame and fear. Shaq watched her retreat, then turned to Mr. Johnson. His voice softened as he said, "There's no need to escalate this further. I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes as long as they're willing to change." His words weren't just directed at Alyssa, they rippled through the restaurant, touching everyone. Some diners bowed their heads in contemplation, while others nodded in silent agreement, recognizing the truth in what he had said. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Shaq's calm demeanor, in stark contrast to Alyssa's unraveling, had captivated not just the staff but everyone in the restaurant. What had been a haven of quiet luxury now served as a stage for an unforgettable lesson. Shaq picked up his knife and fork, resuming his meal with a tranquil composure, as though nothing had happened. Yet everyone in the restaurant knew that his calm was not indifference. It was a lesson imparted with weight and profound meaning. From afar, Alyssa felt the eyes of everyone still lingering on her. What she had done tonight wouldn't simply fade into the background of her job. It would mark a turning point in how she viewed people and her responsibility to them. Shaq placed his utensils down, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and rose from his seat. The room seemed to freeze, every eye fixed on him. No one dared to speak. The silence was only interrupted by the faint clink of glasses and whispers in the distance. All attention remained on Shaq, whose towering presence exuded both tranquility and authority. Alyssa, standing nearby, clung to the edge of the counter, trembling with shame. The murmurs had subsided. The room now held an air of anticipation, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Shaq leaned slightly forward, resting his hand gently on the table. His deep, resonant voice broke the silence. "You know," he began, his tone both approachable and commanding, "my whole life I've been judged, on the court, in the media, and clearly even in restaurants." A faint, awkward chuckle rippled through a few diners, but it quickly faded under the gravity of his words. He turned his gaze toward Alyssa, though there was no malice in his voice. "What you don't realize, Alyssa, is that respect isn't something you give because of how someone looks or what designer labels they wear. Respect is something you give because it's the right thing to do." Alyssa's eyes welled up with tears, her breath trembling. She wanted to look away but couldn't tear herself from his gaze. She stammered, but Shaq raised his hand gently, stopping her. "This isn't just about you," he said, his voice softening. "It's something we all need to reflect on." His eyes swept across the room, meeting the faces of the diners, many of whom now appeared remorseful under the weight of his words. How many times have we judged someone without knowing their story? How many times have we let appearances deceive us into thinking we're better than someone else? Shaq's gaze moved deliberately across the room. His expression remained calm, but his sharp eyes exuded confidence and gravitas. When he spoke again, his deep voice carried the weight of a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. This restaurant was built to welcome everyone, no matter what they look like or where they come from. That's the philosophy the founders, including me, have always believed in. He paused, his eyes moving deliberately from one face to another, ensuring his words landed with their full impact. Then he continued, "Regrettably, today, we have failed to uphold that belief." His words rang like a bell, awakening a collective sense of responsibility. The tension in the room thickened, and some diners lowered their heads, avoiding Shaq's gaze, guilt evident on their faces for having stayed silent and done nothing. A few nodded slightly, their shame unmistakable. From the central table, Mr. Anderson gently set his glass down and shook his head. "It's disgraceful," he said quietly. "He's right. We let this happen without saying a word." Emily, seated at a nearby table, leaned forward, her eyes glowing with admiration. "He's not just addressing the staff. He's addressing all of us." Shaq continued, his voice steady yet laced with profound sincerity. "The world we live in is full of biases. We judge others by their looks, the clothes they wear, how they talk, or what we assume they have or don't have. But I believe that places like the Luminary must be different. This isn't just a place for the wealthy or powerful, it's a place where everyone should feel welcome." He paused, letting his words sink in, then looked directly at Alyssa, not with reproach but with an encouraging gaze. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Alyssa, still standing in the far corner, lowered her head. Shaq's words shone a spotlight on the mistake she had made that evening. She knew there was no excuse to justify her actions, and the weight of the many eyes on her served as a silent reminder of her responsibility. Alyssa nodded slightly, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I understand now. I was wrong." Shaq nodded, his expression softening. "Good. But don't just say it, show it. Treat the next person who walks through that door with the respect they deserve, no matter how they look. He turned to address the entire staff, his tone gentler but unwavering in its resolve. The Luminary isn't just a restaurant. It's a place where we build connections, not based on wealth or appearances, but on respect and understanding. If any of you forget that, we're not just failing ourselves, we're failing the customers who trust us. Several staff members lowered their heads, shame etched across their faces. Ryan, who had been quietly observing, gave a small nod, his eyes reflecting newfound respect for Shaq. Shaq's gaze shifted to the diners, his voice growing stronger again. This isn't just about the staff. It's a responsibility we all share. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right, and I believe the duty, to speak up. Silence, sometimes, is complicity. His words came like a wave, touching each person's heart. Some diners bowed their heads, ashamed for having chosen silence in the face of what had transpired. Others lifted their gazes to Shaq, their eyes now filled with a newfound admiration. Emily couldn't help herself and began to clap gently. Her applause was like a small spark, and in just a few seconds, the entire room joined in. Mr. Anderson nodded in agreement, joining the applause, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Shaq raised his hand, signaling for silence. He turned to Mr. Johnson, who was standing nearby, his face a mixture of anxiety and gratitude. "I believe we can do better," Shaq said, his voice now calm but resolute. "I want to meet with all of the staff after closing tonight. It's time for change." Mr. Johnson nodded, his tone full of respect. "Of course, Shaq. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. We will make it right." Shaq sat back down, continuing his meal as if the powerful speech he had just delivered was entirely ordinary. But it was clear that no one in the room could forget the lesson he had just imparted. In the corner, Alyssa felt the weight of her shame pressing down on her, but beneath the sting of humiliation, a new resolve began to take root. She could see things clearer than ever before: the arrogant remarks, the dismissive tone, and the deliberate attempts to humiliate him. What had she been trying to prove? That she had power over someone else? That she could decide who deserved a place in the glamorous world of the Luminary? The truth of her own prejudice hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and hollow. She was determined to change, to become better, not just for the job, but for herself. As the last diners left the restaurant, the Luminary sank into a rare quiet. The staff gathered in the main space, forming a circle around Shaq, who stood at the center with a calm yet commanding presence. The chandelier above cast its light on his face, highlighting the seriousness and sincerity in his eyes. Shaq scanned the room, his gaze moving from Mr. Johnson, the restaurant manager, to each staff member, including Alyssa, who stood at the edge of the circle, her head bowed as if to avoid his gaze. His voice was deep and steady, each word carrying weight. "We all make mistakes, but what matters is what we learn from them. Mistakes don't define us. How we fix them is what matters." Shaq paused, letting his words sink in. A few staff members nodded subtly, as though realizing that these words weren't just for Alyssa, but for everyone in the team. Shaq continued, his eyes sweeping across the room. "This restaurant isn't just a place to eat. It's a space where people come to experience something special, to feel valued. Our responsibility is to ensure that anyone who walks through that door feels welcomed, no matter how they dress, how they speak, or how much money is in their wallet." Alyssa, standing at the back of the circle, felt as if Shaq's words had pierced her heart. Her eyes glistened, and she bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. But she knew, deep down, she couldn't hide from it forever. Shaq paused again, his gaze locking onto Alyssa. There was no anger, no contempt, only a firm, but trusting look. "Alyssa," he called her name, his tone soft but steady. "Today has been hard, not just for you but for all of us. But I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Alyssa looked up, her eyes red and tear-filled. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the room waiting for her response. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I'm sorry, Chef. I was wrong. I let my bias cloud my judgment, and I didn't fulfill my responsibility. I truly regret it." She took another deep breath, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I didn't realize that respect isn't about how someone looks. I understand now, and I promise to change." Shaq nodded gently, his eyes reflecting both compassion and encouragement. "This change is for you, Alyssa, not for me or anyone else. Change is a process, and I believe you can do it if you truly want to. And this is just the beginning," he said. Alyssa nodded, tears flowing freely now. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping back, knowing that this moment would mark the start of a long and necessary journey to become a better person. His words weren't just for Alyssa, they resonated deeply within everyone present. A few staff members nodded softly, as if realizing they too needed to reassess their own perspectives and actions. Shaq walked toward the center of the circle, his voice dropping but growing even more resolute. "This restaurant is not defined by the luxurious tables or expensive dishes. It is defined by the people, by how we treat each other and our customers. And if we don't do that with respect and kindness, then nothing else matters." The room fell silent, with only the sound of quiet breaths echoing. Mr. Johnson, standing beside Shaq, spoke, his voice filled with gratitude. "Shaq, thank you for your words. We'll make sure the team doesn't just learn from this mistake but truly changes, so that La Lumiere becomes a place where everyone feels welcomed." Shaq nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. He glanced around once more before concluding. "Now is the time to start over, stronger and better. I believe you all can do it." Alyssa wiped her tears, feeling as though the weight on her shoulders had been lifted, but also as if she had been given a new chance to make things right. In Shaq's eyes, she saw no resentment, only a spark of hope, and that made her even more determined to change. That evening, as everyone left the restaurant, not just Alyssa but the entire team at La Lumiere understood that this wasn't just a lesson about work. It was a profound lesson about how to be better people. The glass door of La Lumiere softly closed behind Shaq, leaving the elegant space with its dimmed lights. Outside, the cool air of Bel Air welcomed him. The streetlights of Bel Air illuminated his figure, highlighting each of his strong yet graceful steps as he walked along the sidewalk. The quiet of the late night surrounded him, only the rustling leaves and the distant sound of passing cars breaking the stillness. Shaq walked slowly, his eyes fixed ahead, while his mind lingered on the events of the evening. He thought about the restaurant, about Alyssa, about the team and the diners who had witnessed tonight's moment. Respect, he reflected, is not about status, wealth, or appearance. It's about recognizing the value in each person and choosing kindness over judgment. This wasn't just a lesson for one person, but a lesson for everyone, including himself. Shaq took a deep breath, a small smile forming on his lips. A thought echoed in his mind, strong and clear, just like the words he had spoken in the meeting earlier. The world needs more kindness. True strength doesn't lie in judgment but in acceptance, and it's the small choices we make every day that define who we are. Shaq knew that tonight's lesson wasn't just about handling customers but about how we perceive each other, moving past prejudices, looking beyond appearances to see the true worth of each individual. He thought about Alyssa, who had made a mistake but showed genuine remorse and commitment to change. To him, that meant more than any rebuke or punishment could. Memories of his basketball days suddenly flooded back. He remembered the criticism, the snap judgments people had made about his playing style. He recalled how patience and calmness had helped him through it all, and tonight he found himself in a similar moment. Not on the court, but in a restaurant. As Shaq turned onto a street corner, the neon lights reflected off his face, highlighting his confident yet composed demeanor. He knew his actions tonight weren't meant to flaunt power or prove anything but to plant a seed of change. A change that would not only transform La Lumiere but how people treat each other in the broader world. He paused for a moment, glancing back at La Lumiere, now dimming under the faint light from its windows. He hoped tonight's events wouldn't fade into oblivion but would serve as a lasting lesson for Alyssa, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed it. Kindness, he thought, isn't about grand gestures, but about the small, consistent choices we make every day. When you choose to treat someone well, you don't just change them, you change yourself. Shaq continued walking, leaving the sparkling lights of Bel Air behind. The road ahead seemed endless, much like the message he had conveyed tonight. A road leading to a world where respect and kindness aren't luxuries, but standards, and La Lumiere had become more than just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope, change, and the healing power of small acts of kindness. This story wasn't just about one dinner or a fleeting mistake, it was a deep reminder of the value of understanding and compassion. Through small actions and sincere words, we learn that change doesn't start with something grand, but with the small choices we make each day, choosing empathy, choosing respect, and choosing to see the true value of others. Have you ever had a moment that made you realize the power of kindness? Share your thoughts in the comments, as these stories are the precious inspiration that helps spread the message of compassion and acceptance. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.